Hello, and welcome to this session on SQL Server licensing. My name is Rich Gibbons, and it's my pleasure to take you through these slides. They support the module with the same name in the Microsoft Licensing Solutions Specialist accreditation at getlicensingready.com. If you need reference material, you'll find handouts at this site too. In this session, we're going to focus entirely on SQL Server 2016, and we'll start with some of the fundamental things you need to know about SQL licensing, the basics, and that will be applied strictly to the physical environment. However, we'll then move on to licensing in virtual environments, and also consider things like license mobility and what that can mean to a SQL Server deployment. And finally, we'll end up with a section that will teach you all the supported information you need to know. And that will be, for example, down edition rights and the SS step-ups that are available. So let's get started with the licensing basics. Let's look at the different editions of SQL Server 2016 that are available. The top row is the editions that most businesses will choose to deploy, so Standard or Enterprise Edition. An IT manager typically looks at the functionality of the edition before deciding which one's right for him, and here the functionality increases as you go through the editions. So the higher edition includes all the functionality of the previous edition. So all the functionality in SQL Standard is available in the Enterprise Edition, of course with the extra pieces as well. There are some other editions, so we have Web, Parallel Data Warehouse, Developer and Express editions, and those are aimed at special use cases, but it's the ones at the top that we're going to focus most on in this session. Let's have a look at the licensing models that govern the different editions of SQL Server. So let's start with the Standard Edition, and the first model a customer could choose is the Server and CAL licensing model. Now I'm sure you're probably familiar with this licensing model, but what we'll do in subsequent slides is look at some key points that apply to SQL Server 2016. With the Standard Edition though, the customer has a choice. First choice is Server and CAL licensing, but the second is the core licensing model, and the customer can choose whichever model best fits their business needs. Now let's look at the Enterprise Edition. This is licensed with the core licensing model only, and we'll look at how that works in just a couple of slides. The next edition is SQL Server Web Edition. This too is licensed on a per core basis, but this edition, made for supporting solutions hosted on the web, is only available via the SPLA, Services Provider Licensing Agreement model. The next edition is Parallel Data Warehouse, or PDW for short. This edition is only available on special analytics platform hardware appliances, available from certain OEM hardware manufacturers, and is, with SQL Server 2016, now licensed with Enterprise Edition core licenses. The Developer Edition has all the same features as the Enterprise Edition, but is only available for use in a test and development environment, and so can't be used in production, i.e. on servers that are used to run your business with live data. SQL Server Developer Edition is in fact free to anyone who is a member of the Dev Essentials program, which is in itself free to join. Finally, SQL Server Express. This is also free, and it's a cut down version of SQL with limitations around things such as the amount of memory, database size and compute capacity it can use. It's ideal for people who want to learn SQL Server or who are just starting out with the product. So let's take a look at the specific things that apply to Server CAL licensing for SQL Server 2016. And remember, this licensing model only applies to the Standard Edition. The rules of Server CAL licensing are the usual ones. You buy a license for the server and then CALs, or client access licenses, to access the services of the server. SQL Server 2016 CALs can be used against any SQL server, and that's regardless of platform or edition. So it doesn't matter what infrastructure is used to deploy SQL Server. You may well be aware that the CAL version has to be the same or higher than the server version to which it's licensing access. So if I had SQL Server 2008 R2, for example, 2016 CALs would be absolutely fine, but not the other way around. These CALs are available as user or device CALs, and a customer can choose either. They could choose to mix them, but that would require some SAM processes to be put in place to make sure that they're always compliant. However, that choice is there for the customer. The next point talks about indirect access to SQL Server, and you may have heard this referred to as multiplexing. It could be a situation where a user is using an application that relies on SQL Server, but they don't directly access SQL Server. Even in that case, CALs are required for that user. And the final point I want to touch on in this slide is the notion of external users. An external user is someone who doesn't work for the organisation that's purchasing the licenses, but if they need to give access to these people to their servers, then it's absolutely fine to buy CALs either for their users or their devices. If you've got lots of external users, it's possibly not the most economical way of licensing them, and we'll come to that in the next few slides. So let's have a look now at the rules for core licensing, and as a reminder, the editions that are covered by core licensing are standard and enterprise. But what are the rules? Well, it's quite simple. You count the number of cores in the server, and you buy that number of core licenses. However, there is a minimum of 4 core licenses required for each physical processor, so even if the processor has just 1 or 2 cores, you still need to license it with 4 licenses. Now, there is an additional part of the story when it comes to buying SQL core licenses, as they're actually sold in multiples of 2. So there's a 2-stage process here. Count the number of core licenses you need, and then work out what you need to buy by dividing the total by 2. The final point. No CALs are required with core licensing, and that applies for internal and external users. And core licensing is attractive because it's this fixed price. Once I've licensed my server, there are no additional costs regardless of how many users access that server. And so for large numbers of external users, or where you can't count them, core licensing is very attractive. The next section is all about licensing SQL Server 2016 in virtual environments. We're going to start off by looking at the Server CAL edition, and again, as a reminder, that's just the standard edition. And this is what our diagram is going to look like. You can see here some ghostly servers appearing, and these are going to represent our virtual machines, and you can see that on 2 of them SQL Server is running. So what I need to know is, if I want SQL running on 2 virtual machines on a physical host, how many licenses do I need to purchase if I'm licensing with the Server CAL model? Now the really good thing here is, the rules are the same, regardless of whether it's in a physical environment or a virtual environment. So imagine those were 2 physical servers. How many licenses would you buy? 2, 1 for each of the servers. And the same is true in the virtual environment. So what you need to do is look at your physical servers, see how many machines are running SQL, and then buy that number of licenses. You license at the virtual machine level. In other words, you're counting the virtual machines. But what we're going to see a little bit later, when you assign the licenses, they're actually assigned to the physical server, and I'll come to why that's important in a moment. Let's move now to the editions of SQL Server licensed with core licenses and see how things differ. So here I've got the core editions, and I want to see how the licensing differs here. Again, I've got 4 virtual machines running, and again I've got SQL running in 2 of them. And when you're licensing with the core editions, There's another piece of information you need to know about the virtual servers, and it is, of course, how many virtual cores are being used. You may know, when you set up a virtual machine, you declare how many cores you want it to be using, and that's a piece of information you need to know when you license in this way. And the rule is simple. You just count the virtual cores in the virtual server and buy that number of licenses. But you need to make sure you assign a minimum of 4 licenses. So if I count the cores in each virtual machine, they're both the same here, 2, I can't just assign 2 licenses. I've got to assign a minimum of 4 core licenses to each of those virtual machines. And again, in terms of the actual license assignation, then they're assigned to the physical server and they give rights to run these. But certainly when you're working it out, think of licensing each of the virtual machines. So the rules. License the virtual processors used by the virtual machines, with a minimum of 4 licenses per virtual machine, which is exactly the same rule again as in the physical world. Now, you may have heard me say virtual cores and virtual processors. The words mean the same from a licensing perspective, so I think it's probably easier to think about virtual cores because we know it's a core licensing model. But strictly speaking, when you set up those virtual machines, you're probably actually assigning virtual processors. So from a licensing perspective, consider them to be the same, and you know the rules from this slide here. What we've done, we've looked at the core editions, and we know that applies to standard and enterprise, and that what you're seeing here applies to both editions. But there are some special rules that apply to the enterprise edition only. So let's take a look at those now. So let's take a look at the rules for SQL 2016 Enterprise Core licenses specifically. There's a special rule that applies to the Enterprise Core licenses, and it says if you license completely at the physical level, then you get rights to run a certain number of virtual machines. Have a look at this server here. If we were to license completely at the physical level, then we'd use the rules we learnt in the first section, which is to say, count the total number of cores and then assign that number of licenses. So I need to assign 8 licenses to this server. Having done that, what rights do I actually get? Well, the rights you get are to run 1 virtual machine with SQL Server in it for each license that you've assigned to that server. So here I assign 8 licenses, and you can see 8 virtual machines running there. Your next question may be, what if I wanted to run 10 virtual machines? Well, you're allowed to stack the licenses, and stacking means just assigning more licenses to the physical server on the left. So I'd buy 10 core licenses, and that would give me the rights to run those additional virtual machines. So this is, as I say, a special rule for SQL Server 2016 Enterprise Core licenses, and if you license all the physical cores, you get rights to 1 virtual machine per core license. But often, the next question that people have is, what about unlimited virtualization? So let's look at that next. Unlimited virtualization again applies to SQL Enterprise Core licenses, and the rules are simple. You license again at the physical level, but you add software assurance, and it's the software assurance that gives the rights to run unlimited virtual machines. So I've assigned the same 8 core licenses, but this time with software assurance, and now I can have as many virtual machines running on that device and SQL running in as many of them as I want. So if I wanted unlimited virtualization, there are 2 important things to remember. One is, it's only applicable to SQL Server 2016 Enterprise Core licenses, and the other, you do need software assurance. You can see the rules at the bottom there. License all the physical cores with Enterprise Edition Core licenses with software assurance. So now let us look at SQL Server 2016 Enterprise Edition licensed through the Server Cal model. Now this may be a surprise to you, since this is the first time we've mentioned Server Cal licensing for the Enterprise Edition, and in fact this is a special edition of SQL Server 2016. We've seen that new licenses of SQL Server 2016 Enterprise can only be purchased via the core licensing model. However, up until SQL Server 2008 R2, it was available via the Server Cal model. So if you purchase that and maintain software assurance, you're still able to license SQL Server 2016 Enterprise via the Server Cal model, and that's what we need to talk about here. It's especially important for customers who were licensed for SQL Server 2014 Business Intelligence Edition. You may or may not know that this edition, which has been removed with SQL 2016, was also licensed via the Server Cal model. So if you had SQL Server 2014 Business Intelligence Edition with Active SA when SQL Server 2016 was released, you would now be able to deploy SQL Server 2016 Enterprise Edition licensed via the Server Cal model. As you can see here on the slide, there are some technical limitations when running SQL Server 2016 Enterprise Edition via the Server Cal model. So let's take a look at these in a bit more depth. It's important to note that there are actually two versions of the Enterprise Edition software. One for customers licensed with the core model, and one for customers licensed with the Server Cal model. And an organisation must be sure to only run the version for which they're licensed. When you go to download the software from the VLSC, for example, it's quite clear that one is a Server Cal licensed edition and one is a core licensed edition. First of all, in a physical environment, you're limited to running SQL Server Enterprise on servers with a maximum of 20 physical cores. This is the total across all the physical processors in that server. So for example, if you have 6 processors with 4 cores each, you would be over the maximum limit, and the software wouldn't take advantage of the extra cores available. There are also some differences and limitations when using SQL Server 2016 via the Server Cal model in a virtual environment. The first one is that each SQL Server license allows 4 virtual machines to be run on that server. You'll note that this is different than when you license SQL Server Standard via this model. That gives just 1 VM per license. And that 20 core limit is back again. This time as the maximum number of cores allowed across all the virtual machines being run on that server. Now if you need to run additional virtual machines on the server, you are allowed to stack licenses. That is, assign additional licenses to the server. And for every license that you add, you can run an additional 4 virtual machines. The next thing I want to move on to is license mobility. And license mobility again is important when we look at virtualization. There are a couple of different flavours of license mobility, so I want to look at both of those in this section. Let's take a look at the first flavour of license mobility, which is license mobility across server farms. If you look at the diagram here, I've got a physical server, then running on that are 2 virtual servers, both running SQL. And if I was licensing with the Server Cal model, you know that I'd need 1 server license assigned to each of those virtual machines. Now, I'm going to need to have some more physical servers on my slide here to show a server farm, so let's just tidy away those 2 virtual servers. And you can see the diagram is saying the same thing here. That physical server is running 2 virtual machines, and I need a license for each of them. But let's add on some more servers to our server farm. And you can see I've got another couple of physical servers here that I'm going to be using. From a licensing perspective, I said earlier that the licenses aren't attached to the virtual machines at all. And I said we'd find out why that was important. And it's important here, because actually the licenses are assigned to the physical server. And they give rights to run virtual machines on that server. So here I've got 2 licenses that I've assigned to that physical machine, and then I'm allowed to run those 2 virtual servers. So that's great. I'm compliant at this point, and the licensing is all correct. But one of the reasons for having a server farm is often when you've got virtual machines, you can let them move between the physical hosts, and that's for a variety of reasons. It could be for load balancing, or it could be for failover. It's one of the benefits of virtualization. Here, as the virtual machines move to different physical hosts, for whatever reason, we need to consider what actually happens with the licenses. And you'll notice that the licenses haven't moved. And in fact, they are not allowed to move. Well, they are. The 90-day rule applies, but that's not really very flexible for this situation. So what I'd have to do is buy 2 more licenses for the server at the end, because the 2 virtual machines are running on that server. I can't move the licenses from the first server whenever I want to, because they don't have license mobility. Obviously, with this server farm, those 2 virtual servers could end up on the middle server at any time. So I do need to buy another 2 SQL Server licenses for the middle server as well. This obviously becomes expensive and unrealistic, so in fact, that's not the way you would license this. The way you would license this is to buy software assurance with the licenses. As soon as you buy software assurance with the licenses, they do get license mobility. And license mobility means that the licenses can move as often as you like between the physical servers. So you could think of them as being attached to those virtual servers. As the virtual machines go between the physical hosts, the licenses follow them. That's license mobility across server farms. It allows you to take your virtual machines and have them move freely across the server farm without having to license every single server for maximum capacity. Software assurance gives license mobility across server farms. Software assurance also gives another flavour of license mobility. It's called license mobility through software assurance. If you think of license mobility as the ability to be able to move your licenses to different servers, it's another example of when you might want to do that. But first, let's have a recap. We said on the previous slide that if we add software assurance to the licenses, then they get license mobility across server farms. And you can see that we can now move the virtual machine and the license, in effect, is allowed to follow it. But what's this license mobility through SA that we're talking about now? Well, look at the other virtual server, and you can see that what this SA benefit does is it allows the license to be assigned to a third-party server. This could be a service provider's server, or it could even be Azure. And we've been looking here at server CAL licensing. I've got the single license there assigned to the server, and that's okay. But you could also use it with your core licenses. All you need to know about your service provider's virtual machines that SQL is going to be running on is how many cores have been assigned to it. And then you would need to assign the right number of core licenses, with software assurance, to that virtual server. So, 2 flavours of license mobility, and both of them are important in virtualization. And if you think back over the slides we've just covered, we've been talking about virtualization. If you've got a deployment of SQL Server that is going to include virtualization, then software assurance is a really good thing to consider because it gives you flexibility and in the vast majority of cases cuts costs in deployment. Our final section I've entitled Further Licensing Principles, and this is where we'll look at some of the supporting information that you need to know about licensing SQL Server. The first thing I want to look at here is licensing for high availability. This means having some sort of option available to you if a server should go down. You can see here I've got 2 options. At the top I've got a server, on the left which is running SQL, and it's an active SQL server. In other words, it's giving information to people, devices could be connecting and accessing information, it's running SQL, and it's serving active workloads. On the right hand side, I've got a passive SQL server. This is also running SQL Server, but it's not serving data to anybody or any devices. These 2 databases are always kept up to date, and in this configuration, should the server on the left hand side fail, then the workloads can, in effect, be transferred to the passive server, which then obviously becomes the active server, and there will be limited interruption of service for people connecting to that server. So how is this licensed? Well, if I license the active server, and you can see here I've assigned 12 core licenses to it, if I license that completely at the physical level with those 12 core licenses and add software assurance, then that right-hand passive server is covered by those licenses too. So in other words, SQL can be running on both of those servers, being kept up to date, and as long as the server on the right-hand side is truly passive, so not serving any active workloads, there are no additional licenses required. You can imagine if the active server goes down, the licenses are transferred to the passive server and the licensing is all correct. Other organisations will want to license a backup solution in a different way, and they'll want 2 active servers. And this means that both servers can be serving active workloads to users or devices. And in this case, you need to license both of those machines. In this scenario, you may choose not to add software assurance to the servers. So in an active-passive environment, just license the active server with the core licenses and software assurance. In an active-active environment, both servers need to be licensed. Let's have a look at licensing SQL components. There are various SQL components, and when you've got SQL Server running with all of its components on one server, you license the server in the usual way. So if I'm licensing here with the server cal licensing model, there is one server license assigned to that server. But as soon as I've got different components of SQL Server running on different physical machines, then you need to license those different physical machines separately. Things like reporting services and analysis services, if they're running on separate machines, then you do need to assign different licenses to those machines. All components need to be licensed. If they're all running on one server, then just one license. But if they're separated, you need to have separate licenses. On this slide, you can see the upgrade paths for customers with active software assurance on June 1st, 2016. Most of them are as you would expect. We can see, for example, that SQL Server 2014 standard core licenses can be upgraded to SQL Server 2016 standard core licenses, and the same goes for the Enterprise Edition. What is of note is that the now discontinued SQL Server 2014 Business Intelligence Edition can be upgraded to SQL Server 2016 Enterprise Edition. As we discussed earlier, in this upgrade scenario, it continues to be licensed via the Server Cal model. Customers with existing Enterprise Edition Server Cal licenses can also upgrade to 2016, but again, it's important to note that this is only an upgrade path. Customers can't buy new Enterprise Server licenses. Other important things to know about SQL are what we call downgrade and down edition rights. When you buy a license through volume licensing, you always get the current version, but you also get the rights to install previous versions. So today, if I buy a SQL Server license, it's 2016, but an organisation might need to deploy an earlier version. And this table shows you, on the right hand side, the different versions that can be deployed, and then in the first column, it shows the different editions that can be deployed. Let's take Enterprise Core. There is obviously the fullest set of options here, and this is saying if today I buy SQL Server 2016 Enterprise Core licenses, then actually I could deploy SQL 2014, I could deploy SQL 2008 R2. I'm not giving you an edition there, and in fact if you look in the edition column, it can be any of them. So SQL Server 2016 Enterprise Core licenses today mean that I could deploy SQL Server 2012 Standard. I could deploy the Enterprise Edition of 2008 R2. You get complete flexibility there. That's a useful reference slide. It tells you, for the licenses you buy today, what you can actually deploy in place of those licenses. It also helps show the downgrade paths where editions have changed over the years, so it can be very handy. I want to look at step-ups on this slide. A step-up is a software assurance benefit, and essentially what it allows you to do is to buy a particular edition of SQL Server and then step up to a higher edition. So let's take an example. Say we purchase SQL Server standard licenses with software assurance. Well, as soon as you purchase those licenses and you apply them to the server, it's licensed. But what if I think, oh blimey, we really need some of the enterprise features to enable what we're trying to do now. I really wish I'd bought the enterprise edition. Well, what a step up means is that you don't have to just forget about those standard core licenses you've already purchased. Instead, you can buy a step up license that is effectively the difference in price between the standard core licenses with SA and the enterprise core licenses with SA. So rather than buying full-priced enterprise core licenses, you can pay just the difference above what you've already paid for those standard core licenses. Be aware that you can't step up between the licensing models. You couldn't go from standard server to enterprise cores. It's just that single step up that's available. But again, this is useful if you've got software assurance and you can move easily to a higher edition license by buying the SA step up. That concludes our session on SQL Server 2016 licensing. You may now want to go and do the associated exam at getlicensingready.com. So the very best of luck to you, and my recommendation to you would be to download the handout and have that to hand as you go through the exam. So good luck, and I look forward to talking to you again in some other modules.